So our next speaker is a gentleman who's been very much involved over the years in looking at the past, but looking at the past in a number of ways: the historical view, the biblical view. Where do they meet? Can one sort of explain the other? Are they one and the same? Is one myth? Is one real? And he has written many books and been very involved with metallurgy, looking at ancient metals, which actually can tell us an awful lot about the past. And he's had a fascination with Moses. Where Moses Stood is his latest book. And when you start to put the pieces of all this together, you realize that maybe some of what we may think is myth may not be. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Robert has to say. And a big hand, please, for Robert Feather. Thank you.
That's a good start. Right. I'm going to talk about two particular areas of accepted knowledge that is wrong. One is the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in 1969 by Klaus Schmidt, which completely changed or should have, the chronology of archaeology and history. And yet it hasn't got into mainstream. And it's a wonder why. The second area will be something that, how do I get this to move on?
Click on the right.
Okay. So I've not excavated here, so I will be very brief about this, and a lot of you probably know about Göbekli Tepe. What it is shown is that a structure, a temple-like structure of giant stones in the shape of a T, rather like Stonehenge, is 5,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids. And that has really undermined conventional history. And it should have a profound effect on our understanding of where we evolved from. It has strange carvings, letters, animals, Neolithic animals, and it proves that 11,000 years ago, BC, there were people who are relatively civilized and were creating a language. Conventional history says there were only hunter-gatherers at that time, but it's clearly wrong. And yet, we don't seem to have taken that on board. And it also impinges on the evolution of language and alphabet, because they were beginning to write in a form that hadn't yet been evolved. And the normal understanding is that we got our alphabet and our letters from Egyptian hieroglyphics, which evolved down into Sinaitic Hebrew, and that became Latin and Greek and so on. And the alphabet all came from that direction. But clearly there was something going on 5,000 years before that that hasn't been taken into account. This is really an area where I have excavated myself and explored in the Sinai. This is Zarapula, Frederica Zarapula. She's on television quite a lot. And she, like a lot of other academics and scholars and theologians, don't believe that the Exodus actually took place. And yet, the evidence is overwhelming. And we'll see why they are all wrong in saying that there is no Exodus. And Exodus is thought to have taken place in the 13th century BC, when the Hebrews, who were in Egypt, in the Delta region, en masse moved across to the promised land of Canaan. What I'm going to show is the route of that Exodus from the Delta region in Egypt, the precise Mount Sinai where Moses collected or wrote down himself, who knows? That I really can't determine, and we can't. But I will describe the mountain where the Ten Commandments were received, and the remains of a desert tabernacle. And this is one of the miraculous things about this story. We still have some of the tabernacle from about 1220 BC, when the Israelites or the Hebrews were moving across, stopped at a place called Timnah in the Sinai, and they then moved on to the Promised Land. We're going to see an example of the copper snake, which is mentioned in the Bible, that Moses used to ward off poisonous serpents that were attacking his followers. That is still in existence in a museum in Israel. But the sacred item once carried in the Ark of the Covenant, I'm not going to go into that too much, but proof of whether this is the correct mountain is really what I'm going to talk about. There are dozens of claims for the correct Mount Sinai. I listed about 20 of them recently. They're all wrong. They vary from northern Syria, an awful lot in Jordan. People assume that Petra was the place of Mount Sinai. None of them work. There are no pieces of evidence that correlate with the biblical description. But the place that I've explored in Sinai, and I've been exploring there for about 4 years, has all the characteristics that identify this place as the correct Mount Sinai. What got me into this area of study was the copper scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I met a chap called Hanan Eshel, and he told me about a copper scroll that was part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And being a metallurgist, I was intrigued. I wanted to know, what's a copper scroll doing amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls? This is sort of engraved about the time of Jesus by a very strange aesthetic, monastic, male-only community that lived at Qumran by the Dead Sea. And so I started following the trail of the copper scroll itself. And the more I looked at that, there's, I've got a pointer here somewhere. Here we are. This is how the copper scroll was when they cut it open into 23 dish-shaped slices. And you were able to read on the inside the text. And it was a list of buried treasure. 64 locations where treasure and other valuable items, unguents, other scrolls were apparently hidden. And it was found in 1952 in Cave 3 at Qumran. And from that time, it was cut open in 1955, 1956 in Manchester University, of all places. No one had dared open this brittle scroll that had been found in a cave by the Dead Sea. John Allegro was one of the team on the Dead Sea Scroll translators, told them that he'd originally studied at Manchester University, that they would have the technology to do it, and they did. And you could read inside, and you could see listed items of treasure, and it gave the weights and the depths where they were buried and so on. At the top, that is what it must have looked like when it was first. Top illustration, the copper scroll when it was first produced. Copper at the time of its carving and hammering on, probably about the time of Jesus, 100 BC, up to about 68 CE. Copper would have been incredibly valuable. So why were they doing that? And clearly the reason is that they wanted it to last. They probably had a version on papyrus or parchment which had deteriorated, so they wanted something that would last. When I started studying it, I found it's written in an ancient form of Hebrew. but there are strange additions to it. And if you can see on this bottom here, this is a transliteration of the text in ancient Hebrew, but there are also Egyptian terms there, the numbering system where they said, dig down 10 cubits and you'll find X talents of gold, and the talent that they were using, the numerator they were using, was an Egyptian numerator. Why were they doing that? This is essentially a document of a devout, secretive Jewish Hebrew community, and yet within in the scroll, the copper scroll, were Egyptian terms. And let's go on. There were 13 Greek letters also scattered amongst the text. What was Greek being used for? And when no one knew what they meant, they were undecipherable, I came along and started studying and analyzing. I like puzzles. And I put the 13 Greek letters together in groups of 3, and I connected 10 of them, and I read the name Akhenaton. And I wasn't sure who Akhenaton was at that time. I went and consulted Professor Rosalie David at Manchester University, and she said, well, if they wanted to write the name of a pharaoh by the name of, excuse me, Akhenaton, those are the Greek letters they would use. And I said, oh, how can that be? She said, I don't know, because his name was expunged from history almost by the Egyptians. He was considered to be a deviant pharaoh. But in fact, when I looked and found a bit more about him and read a book called Moses and Monotheism by Sigmund Freud, it became clear that Akhenaton was clearly, actually, the first monotheist, the first person in history to look to one God, one sole invisible God, very similar to the God that the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam now worship. And that was a revelation. So I had to go to Egypt to look and see the capital city of Akhenaton, where Akhenaton, about the 14th century BC, decided to take the capital of Egypt from Thebes to a completely virgin place on the Nile, and built a new city dedicated to his new, invisible, all-powerful God. And he tried and effectively did convert an awful lot of people in Egypt to this, from paganism and polytheism. And for 17 years, he ruled and created a civilized society that believed in only one God. How effective that was in convincing everyone, we don't know, but certainly he had a lot of followers. And it became clear when I started looking at the history of, this is Akhenaton, the pharaoh who, he called his name for the invisible God that he advocated worshipping, Aten, the Aten. Now, if you look at the lettering of the A-T-E-N in hieroglyphics, the T and the D in hieroglyphics are interchangeable. So instead of Aten, you can get Adon. And Adon is the name that the Hebrews call God. So there was clearly a resonance that came through into this is the site of his city on the Nile, halfway down the Nile, where he built a virgin city and a huge temple, a temple 800 meters by 300 meters, one of the largest temples in the Middle East. And when I studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are two significant scrolls there, the Temple Scroll and the New Jerusalem Scroll. It's called the New Jerusalem Scroll because the scholars who translated it had no idea whether it could be somewhere else other than Jerusalem. Their only understanding was that a temple of this size could relate to Jerusalem, but it didn't. And in fact, in the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, they give the dimension of the temple that's being described. It's being described in the Temple Scroll, in the New Jerusalem Scroll, and also we find that Ezekiel talks about being taken around a huge temple. The dimensions aren't spelled out, but they are spelled out in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the dimensions spelled out in the Dead Sea Scrolls exactly match the side of the temple that Akhenaton built at his capital, Akhetaten, on the Nile. And scholars have looked at it and said, well, this is just weird. How did they know the size of this temple? I think they knew because the Hebrews who had come to his capital city with Joseph. If you remember the biblical story, Joseph goes to Egypt because there's a famine in the whole of the Middle East, and he's looking for food. He goes there, and then he brings his family. He brings Jacob and all the other brothers and members of his tribe, who are going, in fact, to become the followers of this religion. They take up the religion of Akhenaton as a monotheistic belief in one invisible God. 17 years he rules, but he has dispossessed the priests at Thebes, and in doing that he's deprived them of their income, so they cannot take on board his beliefs and resent it, and when they get the opportunity, they probably kill him. And so that period, 17 years of almost pure monotheism, where women are created exactly equal to men, and the religion is open to everybody. The temple he built has no roof, and he specifically describes the reason for that, so that all the people can have access to God in heaven. And he was a philosopher, an emancipator, and highly unrecognized as one of the first great philosophers of religion. So the Hebrews who'd come from Canaan because of the famine and came to Akhenaton's capital, one of them was Joseph, and I think this is how the religion comes out of Egypt to the Promised Land. So you can see Heliopolis, which was known as On, Memphis, Cairo, and the land of Goshen, which is where the Bible says that the Israelites were sent after Akhenaton expires or disappears from history, and the pagan priests of Egypt get back into power, and they set them to work, if you like, building temples and forts and goodness knows what in that area of the Delta region of Egypt. But they brought with them the religion of Akhenaton, the idea of one God. And they're out of favor because their Pharaoh is no longer there to protect them, so they are put into servitude. You know, the story of the Hebrews being made slaves and building the pyramid. They obviously didn't build the pyramids, but they built temples and other palaces for Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh, at that time, now when we've moved on up to about 1220 BC, and Moses has arrived on the scene. He's born. He's probably an Egyptian prince. there are a number of reasons why I can maintain that. Won't go into details of it, but they are then encountered in the land of Goshen in the Delta region. Moses studies at On, this place Heliopolis is a traditional place for learning and study. And there, I think he picks up the residual knowledge of a belief in one God. And he likes it. He's highly intellectual, as well as being a military chariot leader in his own right, and wealthy in his own right, extremely wealthy as a prince of Egypt. So he finds this belief is still existing in Heliopolis. That's the modern name for On. And he also then discovers that there's a people living in the area, particularly in the Delta area, who also only believe in one God. And these are the Hebrews who were at the court of Akhenaton, who were dispossessed and taken into servitude, if you like. And he says to himself, these people believe in the same God that I now believe in, one God. I will make them my people. I will protect them. And even goes further. He decides to take them out of the pagan environment of Egypt and take them to Canaan, another place where they will be safe to practice their belief in one God freely. So he buys their freedom, probably. It's the conventional understanding that there were 10 plagues and Pharaoh, who at this time now is very belligerent, and Ramses II. We're still about 1250, 1260 BC. He buys the freedom of the Israelites. The stories of the 10 plagues, I think, are all... the plagues had happened, but not at the same time. And they were not the reason that that Ramses released the Hebrews. It's because Moses, as a prince of Egypt, ransomed them. In fact, the Bible mentions the phrase. It says that they are ransomed, the people. They're not prized out by 10 plagues that encourage Ramses to let them go. Moses buys the freedom, and he leads them probably from the land of Goshen, which is the Delta region, and that red dotted line is my estimation of the route that they took. They go nowhere near St. Catherine's Monastery, which is in southern Sinai, the conventional place where people believe that the Ten Commandments were received, but there's nothing going for that particular place. I don't know if everyone's been there. It's a beautiful, beautiful monastery and well worth visiting. But it was only designated by Constantine's mother, Helena, as a place worth going to. She said that that's where Jesus had his transfiguration. And we're now in the 4th century CE. Helena, Emperor Constantine's mother. There is supposed to be a burning bush there, he said, or she said, and also the place of the giving of the Ten Commandments. And there is a big mountain there. It's about 7,400 feet high, but it has none of the characteristics that the Bible describes for the Mount Sinai. So they follow that route, and somewhere along that route, they stop at a place called Timnah. No, gone on. Come back. This is St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. Allegedly a place where the Ten Commandments were collected, but it's not. It's not the right place. The problem for most people, like Zarapulo and many, many other theologians and historians, to discount the story of the Exodus as a real event. And these are the sort of reasons they give. That the Bible talks about 605,000 males being brought out during the Exodus, male Hebrews from Egypt. 605,000 would equate to about 2.5 million people with wives and children. So clearly that figure is completely ridiculous. And to even think of considering it as a reason not to believe in the Exodus is wrong, because the term that they used in the Bible for 1,000 is 10 times less than that if they used the correct translation of the term Eleph. So there's nothing like 605,000. It's more like about 40 or 50,000, which makes the numbers feasible. That sort of number of Hebrews could come out from Egypt. They say it was impossible for the desert to sustain such large numbers for 40 years. So that, in a sense, today would be true. But in the 13th century BC, the climate in the Sinai was much, much more favorable. There was vegetation. There would have been opportunities for water, oases along the way. So that really is not a reason. They say there's no archaeological remains in the Sinai of such a large number, even if it is only 30 or 40,000, not to appear to have left some traces of the transit through the desert of Sinai. Again, wrong. And I've argued with a lot of academics and theologians and scholars, and at the hub of the problem for most of them is they've never heard of a chap called Rothenberg. And Rothenberg was an archaeologist who he established the Institute of Archaeology at University College, and he excavated for about 15 years all over Sinai, and he wrote extensively about his findings and finding evidence of large-scale people living in the desert, particularly at two places, Seraphim Kadem, which was a mine that the Egyptians had been exploiting for turquoise for thousands of years, and also at Timna, which the Egyptians had been exploited for also for several thousand years, mining copper. And at those sites, thousands of people were able to, this is before the Hebrews come through, the Egyptians were employing Midianites and Amalekites to do the work for them. And thousands of them were able to survive in the desert. So this suggestion that there's not enough sustenance there is wrong, because we know that the Egyptians had thousands of people working away in mines. And they left archaeological remains in the Sinai. And Benno Rothenberg, who excavated extensively in the Sinai, found evidence of not just the Midianites and Amalekites, which are two of the tribes mentioned in the Bible as being involved with the Mount Sinai. These are the sort of people who've excavated, and the one in red, 1959 to 1980s, Benno Rothenberg, wrote extensively on his findings, but no one seems to, this is another one of those, if you like, biblical illusions that we have no evidence of anyone coming through Sinai. That's not true. It's just completely wrong. And go and look at the work of Benno Rothenberg online or his books, and you'll see that he describes dozens of sites where large populations were able to survive. That's him. He unfortunately died in 2012. I was unfortunately not able to meet him. I wish I had. I met one of his sponsors, Sigmund Sternberg, who funded most of his expeditions. And he told me an awful lot about Benno Rothenberg. And he was appalled at the lack of recognition of his work. Conventional scholars and archaeologists didn't seem to want to know that he'd unearthed definite evidence of a large number of people coming through in the Exodus. Ramses II's son, Ramses II is almost certainly the Egyptian pharaoh of the oppression. He was the one who was making the Hebrews work for Egyptian building projects in the Delta region, building palaces and temples. And his son, Meneptah, I'm sure, was the pharaoh who was the pharaoh of the pursuit. Remember in the story in the Bible when Pharaoh changes his mind and says, I want them back now, they were useful to me, and he sends Meneptah to pursue them. And the Bible says that Meneptah, with his chariots, chased after the Hebrews in the desert and came to a sticky end, probably in the Bitter Lakes area, not in the Red Sea, as some people mistakenly assume. They never got to the Red Sea. They didn't need to go across the Red Sea. This illusion about a Red Sea crossing. You don't need to cross the Red Sea. You can go via Eilat. You can walk from Sinai into Jordan via Eilat. I've done it. There's no problem. There's no water. There's nothing to stop you. So Meneptah is pursuing the Hebrews, who are being led out of Egypt by Moses, and he comes to a sticky end. That's what the Bible says, but that's what history and biological evidence says, because you can see on the left is the mummified body of Ramses II, and most pharaohs' mummies you see are very black. The mummification process of natron and tar leaves their surface very dark and black. But the mummy of Meneptah, his son, who I maintain was the pharaoh of the pursuit, the one who tried to catch the Israelis, the Hebrews. We can't call it Israelis yet. They're not in Israel. That's a wrong terminology. He chases after them, and he comes to a sticky end, just as the Bible relates. We know that because autopsies on his body shows not only is his face white because they embalmed him with salt rather than the natron from Natron Valley, they had to obviously do it in a hurry. And he now has, this is in the Cairo Museum. There are both of those bodies are in the Cairo Museum. And I think it's in the next slide. Yeah, here we are. This is the famous Meneptah Stela. The first mention of Israel in Hebrew in history occurs in the Meneptah Stela, which is a very large basalt stela in the Cairo Museum, and it lists the conquest of Meneptah, Pharaoh Meneptah. And when it comes to battles with Ashkelon, Gaza, Yanom, in the text of the Meneptah Stela, the determinative for those places is a circle with a dot in it, which is a hieroglyphic indication that this is a place. When it comes to the mention of Yisrael as a people that he had a battle with, there's no determinative of a circle with a dot indicating a place, but the determinative is a man and a woman, indicating a people in transit, which is exactly supports the evidence of the Bible. And you can see the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Where's my pointer? You see that image of a man and a woman on the left? I'm not doing this right, am I? Here. There's a woman. She's crouching down to give birth. That's the kind of hieroglyphics the Egyptian used for a woman. And there's a man beside her. So, and this succession of hieroglyphics to the right reads Yisrael, Israel. So we have a people, Israel, that he has defeated in some kind of encounter. And because they're not a place, it looks like they are in transit from Egypt to Israel, or Canaan as it was known then. We've skipped on a bit here, but where they stop is incredibly significant. And they stop at a place called Timnah, which is in a range of mountains close to the border with Canaan, still in the Sinai Desert area as such. And the Bible talks about a copper snake as being mounted on a pole by Moses. We have that copper snake, or we have an example of it from the excavations that Benno Rothenberg conducted at Timnah. You saw one of the images of a possible stylized form of the face of Hathor at Timnah, and this is a site at the base of a mountain, which I maintain is the correct Mount Sinai, where Moses stopped with the Israelites, and the Bible says they defaced the figure of Hathor. Hathor was a cow goddess that the Egyptians worshipped. It's a goddess of merriment and dancing, just as the Bible talks about. If you remember, when Moses is up the mountain and they're reveling because they have worried about Moses not coming down. And they started worshipping Hathor, this cow goddess. And Moses comes down and apparently breaks the command, the stones that he's got the Ten Commandments on, and has to go up and get them again. That face of cow god was found at Timnah. So these stories were not made up. That's the image of the cow goddess in Egypt, and they were sometimes made of gold. The Bible talks about a golden calf, but clearly the one they were worshipping at Timnah was carved from stone. Now we're homing in on the mountain of God, if you like. Of all the dozens of examples of people who said the mountain is here, it's there, none of them work. This one is the correct one. And at the base of it, and I've explored all the way around it and in the desert area in front of it in Sinai, there is a temple area, an enclosure, as you can see there. And one of the things the Bible talks about in this temple area at Mount Timnah, at Sinai, the mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments, it says there are 12 standing stones. There are 12 standing stones within this temple area. There are libation vessels here and here, just as the Bible mentions. It's not a coincidence. There are too many factors. The copper snake, the image of Hathor, the Egyptian cow goddess, the standing stones, the libation vessels, and as we'll see, there's something more extraordinary that convinced me, and I think it'll probably convince you, and I'm happy to take questions if we have a chance later on to demonstrate that to you. Let's go on. Okay. That is an ad hoc. I'm not a very good artist, as you can see. That was drawn while I was at that site in Timnah, by that enclosure at the base of a mountain. And that mountain is not enormously high, but there's a part about 80 or 90 feet up which you can climb. And there is a platform on which I believe Moses must have stood to speak to the children of Israel, his followers who were spread out on the plain in front of him. And the acoustics are very weird there. I went about 100 meters from the mountain, but I could hear voices on the mountain of people who were walking around on there, climbing it. And you have a very strange effect also in one section. If you shout at the mountain, Mount Timnah, you get a reverberation of a voice. Your voice comes back in a very strange way, which may explain this suggestion that God spoke to the children of Israel in a voice from the mountain. The mountain is also described as being in a cloud of smoke. And if you remember in the Bible talks about the children being led by night and by day by a pillar of fire. What's that all about? I've never heard anyone just saying, what do they mean? They say, well, it's a miracle. God has given them a sign for the route. But it's not quite as miraculous as that, actually, because here at Timnah, we should go back maybe, they are smelting copper. And when you're smelting copper, you're going to have smoke and fire going up into the sky by day and by night. And that is what they were seeing. There actually was a pillar of fire leading them towards the promised land. And there is mention in the Bible as well of furnaces. How do you get furnaces in the desert? You don't, unless there's some actual industrial activity going on. And this was a big industrial activity, something like 1,000 different sites where they were smelting the copper that been mined from Timnah, from Mount Timnah. And that is let's go back to where we were. Okay, so that enclosure, I measured it with the help of my wife with a tape measure, and I measured it to 34'9" by 29'6". So how does that relate to what the Bible says? It relates within a few inches of what the Bible says this shrine will be. And how do you determine that? You determine that because the Bible tells you the curtain widths of the ark of the tabernacle that's going to go over this shrine area. The Bible could not have known that as a figure to record, except, well, this is a slight diversion. How does the information about the standing stones, about the libation vessels, about the Hathor imagery, the copper snakes, the size of this shrine, how does that get into the Bible? How do they learn about that? And I think the answer is that we don't appreciate it as much as it was in ancient times. Word of mouth transmission was far, far securer and prevalent in those times. People would sit down around the fire at night and they would relate stories, and they say, my father told me, and his father told him, and so and so. And that's how it gets passed down, and from about 1220 BC to 800 BC, when the Bible is written down in written form in Hebrew. And that's how we get this in Exodus, in the Bible. We get these dimensions spelled out. And those dimensions match the actual dimensions on the ground within a few feet, sometimes within a few inches. So the transmission, the memory transmission was highly reliable. But that is a side issue in the sense what it demonstrates is that they were there at this site by this mountain, and that this was the mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments. And this is the correct Mount Sinai. All the other postulations are not correct. And as I mentioned, there are dozens of different claims to have found the true Mount Sinai. They're all wrong, all completely wrong. This is the correct one. Now, what happens now? The Egyptians have been mining copper here for several thousand years. It was an incredibly valuable commodity, very precious, and they had Midianites and Amalekites doing the work for them. The Bible mentions Midianites and Amalekites specifically as being involved with the followers of Moses, the Hebrews, as they're coming out of Egypt. It knew about that. The Bible knows about what was happening and knew about it. The Egyptians abandoned the site around about 1210 BC. They've had a disastrous encounter at Kadesh with the Hittites, and the Hittites have driven them back from their the Egyptians' traditional territories that they conquered, right the way up to Anatolia and towards what is now Syria. They drove the Egyptians back to their traditional boundary, the other side of the Nile, and they abandoned the Sinai area completely. What happens when you abandon an area? Someone else moves in. Well, there was no one else to move in, but there were people already there, namely the Midianites and the Amalekites. So they took over mining the copper at Timnah. It was a precious metal that they would have been able to become very wealthy with. The Midianites traditionally worshipped, guess what? A copper snake. That was their idol. And they would have put the copper snake as an idol in the side of the mountain, in the 2 or 3 niches, which Benno Rothenberg analyzed and excavated and studied. And he said that these were places where initially there would have been the goddess Hathor statue in those niches, because the Egyptians worshipped the cow goddess Hathor. But when that was removed, it was replaced by a copper snake, which we got examples of both of these. The other thing that the Midianites did was they liked to put a tent over their shrine. The Egyptians are gone, the Midianites are in control. They put a tent over the shrine. In the background, you can see there are the niches where the statue of Hathor would have sat. And then it would have had a copper snake in there after the Midianites took control. And the Egyptians have abandoned it. And that tent became the holy tabernacle, the Mishkan of the Bible, that Moses, according to the Bible, is instructed to build. He didn't build it, it was already there. He may well have embellished it with precious stones and fine linen, but the essential main part of the tabernacle was already there because the Midianites had erected it. And Benno Rothenberg, when he was excavating, he was perplexed with this, and he says, this tent reminds us of the tabernacle, the holy tabernacle, where the Ark of the Covenant would have stood. But he wouldn't quite go as far as to say that this was the tabernacle described in the Bible. And I think the reason for that is the Bible says that God instructs Moses to build a new tabernacle for me to house the Ark of the Covenant, and gives him specific details of the sizes and how to make it. I mean, Exodus spends a huge amount of time describing the tent the Ark of the Covenant is going to sit in. But Benno Rothenberg thought, well, this cannot be right because God instructed Moses to build a new tent. And I can't accept that they took a second-hand tent. So we can't quite go as far as accepting this as the description of a tabernacle as in Exodus. But it's there. It's not there now, of course. When the Hebrews came, they saw this tent and they took it over, and it became the tabernacle. When they left, they took a transportable tent with them, but they left this structure here, and the altar area, those white flagstones, was where the Ark of the Covenant would have stood. And Benno Rothenberg noted that there were holes for supporting a tent in that temple area, and concluded that this must have been the exact place where Moses erected a tent, or the tabernacle. 5 minutes? I can't believe it. I was going to have some questions. Oh, gosh. Now, here's where it gets a bit miraculous, because not only do we still have some of the copper stakes in the possession of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, we have examples of the Hathor cow, but we also have examples of this blinking tent. We have fabric from this tent, because when Rothenberg excavated, he found piled up behind the wall there, red and blue texture, fine linen texture, as described in the Bible. So we have examples of the original Mishkan, tabernacle, in which the Ark of the Covenant would have stood. This place should be one of the most holy places certainly for Jewish people, and for Christendom as well, if you believe in the reality of the Bible and the transmission. And we have those. That's the temple area. Above, high on the wall, is an inscription, and I clambered up and I looked at it, and the guidebook says it's hieroglyphics. It's not hieroglyphics. It's an ancient form of Hebrew. It's like the Israeli the Canaanites that they're going to become, the Israelites in transit, see above this temple, we're about 80 foot high on the mountain. And when we're above the platform that Moses would have stood to read the Ten Commandments out to the children, there's an image of Ramses II paying obeisance to Hathor. And they've put an inscription under here, which people have read as a hieroglyphic. It's not. It's a Hebrew, an early Proto-Sinaitic Hebrew inscription that proves that the Hebrews were here. I took this to experts, and they confirm it's not hieroglyphics. It's Israelite writing. So the Israelites must have been here. There's no other explanation. That's it in close up. These are some of the precious stones that they must have used to embellish the Midianite temple, which then becomes a glorified tabernacle. And we haven't got time to go through all this, but there are at least 18 different correlations that the Bible in Exodus says will be at this holy mountain that are actually there on the ground. I think I better stop now, because I could go on forever.
Robert, thank you very much.
Thank you.